Well, thank you all for coming out. It's like the most beautiful place I've ever read, I think. Feel free to look at that. So, Mrs. Fletcher, I just feel like I have to say this. The book takes place in 2014. And so when I was writing it, I felt like I was sort of up to the minute. And, you know, it was a time when there were a lot of problems in America, but we also, one problem we didn't have was that our president was not a neo-Nazi sympathizer. And so the book has just this little bit of unexpected nostalgia. It was like, yeah, things weren't easy then, but they weren't this. And I just, you know, just feel like I need to say it because in a funny way, the book, it deals with a lot about what we were talking about in 2014. It's about sex and identity, and it's about this moment when what had been a kind of academic discussion of gender and identity sort of burst into the mainstream culture. And the main character is a 46-year-old divorced mother with one child and an 18-year-old son. In the first chapter, she brings him to college, and she comes home and just basically has to figure out, what's my life now? This big part is over. You know, what happens next? And the book really is, you know, what happens next for both of them, how they sort of invent themselves or fail to invent themselves over the course of that year when they're both on their own. So I'm going to read to you, though, a section that, so Eve Fletcher, Mrs. Fletcher, the title, runs a senior center. And I'm going to start with one of her employees becomes a very important part of her life, and we'll start with her. Her name's Amanda, and then we'll meet her, and then I'll just switch to a short section about Eve on the same day. This is a chapter called, and then I'll read briefly, and then we'll just talk. This is called Trouble in Sunset Acres. It was only Thursday afternoon, but Amanda could already feel the weekend coming on like an illness, a mild case of the flu, or some mid-level gastrointestinal distress. The kind of ailment that didn't leave you bedridden, but kept you confined to the couch, unfit for human interaction. You just had to wait it out in your sweatpants, binging on Netflix and herbal tea, a 48-hour quarantine until Monday rolled around and you could head back to work. She understood how pathetic that sounded. Exactly the opposite of how you were supposed to feel if you were a youngish single person with an office job that paid less than peanuts and made a mockery of your expensive education. A job, moreover, that required you to spend a good part of your life in the company of old people, some of them physically and or mentally infirm, and many others just plain ornery. You were supposed to love the weekend, that all too brief window of freedom, your only chance to wash away the stink of boredom with a blast of fun. Use it to drink and fuck yourself into a state of blissful oblivion, the memory of which would power you through the work week that followed, at which point you could do it all over again, ad infinitum, or at least until you met the right guy or gal and settled down.
So I've read your novel, but I don't much tell me that I didn't know you TV writer of your work. So you feel that's more fulfilling, more fun? You write less? Does that bother you?
That's a question about my moonlighting as a TV writer. So people here probably know I wrote the novel Leftovers and then worked on the show for the past 3 seasons. I wasn't the showrunner, I was just like one of the writers in the room. It was the complete opposite of my normal job, which is me alone in the room, making every decision that, putting every word on the page one after the other. Writing a TV show is a very social, collaborative, sometimes maddening process. But it was a lot less writing. It was a lot more talking and a lot less writing, and it was, every decision has to be sort of talked out loud and negotiated, and you have to reach a kind of a consensus, which sometimes you feel like the group went the wrong way. Sometimes they want to go where you want to go, and then you think they're all the greatest people in the world.
Does that impact your writing now? How you write? Because affected by.
Everybody asks me that, and it would make sense that it would, but when I look at this book, and I look at the Wishbones, which I wrote 20 years ago before I did any TV or film, I can recognize the same writer. So I think it was more like the style that I was developing was suited for adaptation to the screen. And in fact, the real thing that happened was working in TV and film led me to really appreciate what is unique to fiction writing, which is the internal part of it, the way you can track somebody's inner dialogue. Or in this case, I just read you Eve and Amanda, and they're in a kind of a third person. It's a quiet, close third person. But Brandon, the son, is narrated in first person, and he's a kind of a jerky frat boy. And that's the kind of thing you can't do that in a film. Just get like somebody's voice telling you who they are. So, or you can't move in time. It's a little awkward to move in time in film sometimes. So I end up really feeling like working with film made me appreciate what what's available to me as a fiction writer. So this is a question specifically about Mrs. Fletcher and what drew me to this character and this subject matter. So in the broadest sense, I would say that I have been tracking my own life. Like when I was in my 20s and wondering, am I going to be able to have this career as an artist that I want to have, I wrote a book called The Wishbones, which was about rock musicians who were coming to that same moment of like, do I keep going with this or do I throw in the towel? When my kids were little, I wrote Little Children, right after I'd spent all that time on the playground with them. I had done a lot of like soccer coaching for my kids, and that came into the abstinence teacher. And then I think this book is really about the time when your kids grow up and leave, and you have to figure out what your life is now. Now, in my own case, I think the classic story of the emptiness is these parents have to figure out what their marriage is now that they're done. But in this story, the emptiness really is empty. It's just Eve there, and I somehow or other. I mean, it's not somehow or other. People who know my work, especially with children in the absence teacher, it's a lot about sex and the way that sexual culture has been kind of in flux in our country. And the fun of this book is watching a 46-year-old woman essentially enter into the sexual culture of 20-somethings, where she's watching porn and she's texting and she's experimenting with her queer identity and sexual possibilities that hadn't been a part of her life before. And so I think, and meanwhile her son is in college trying to live out this sort of frat boy dream of what college is in a world that's suddenly become a little bit hostile to that.
What drew you to telling this story specifically? I know you mentioned earlier during your talk going through the steps of your life, but is there anything that drew you specifically to the idea of technology and how it's being used today, in terms of like dating and romance?
Yeah, well, I do feel like, we're still living through the sexual revolution that started, 50s and 60s. And one of the things that's meant is that basically every generation has its own experience of sex. Mm-hmm. So my parents had a particular one, my generation had ours. and now I'm very convinced that my kids have another one, and part of it is because of the way that porn has become so ubiquitous, but mainly it's because the phone allows all these sort of new ways to be intimate, through technology. And it seems somehow like those two ideas came together. Of here's a woman who is searching for some way to jumpstart her love life and reclaim a sexual identity, and here are all these technological ways that have arrived, and they're not usually necessarily designed for people of her generation, but there they are, and she starts to use them, and it really does shake up her life in the way that she was hoping.
And about that, I was wondering, we heard you talk earlier about writing the book in 2014 and setting it in 2014. Between then and now, has any of that technology changed enough to the point where getting closer to the book's release, you're thinking, oh, I have to change this because it's already kind of become obsolete? I know there's a lot about like Tinder and BuzzFeed lists, like the 25 like celebrities who might be bi. Has any of that change as you were writing it?
I never figured out Snapchat and its uses, for example, and like who knows if that'll stick, but
it's a great way to date, something with technology.
But so I don't think there's anything new and gigantic that has changed that would alter anything in the book. Whereas like the arrival of the iPhone and its ability to mean that anybody could film their sex life at any moment. You didn't even need that camera. It's like it's just there. I think that was like a kind of a revolutionary thing, and all the apps that came out of that allowed people to connect instantly. Those did, that I think we're still in that revolution. I don't know whatever the next phase will be, but it's I guess it's this stuff that people are writing about, which is there are now these like robots, where you don't even need another person. You can have some simulation of another person. Is yet one more barrier between you and your desires has fallen away.
One of the other things you often write about is suburban American life. And there's an interesting quote that I pulled when I was flipping through it earlier, that Amanda, the character, says that there's kind of a reverse hipster migration back to the suburbs from the cities because of, I think, the prices in big cities. How has that, I think, affected suburban life and your idea of what suburban life is going to be in the future going forward?
Well, I mean, one of the things that I certainly have noticed, like my mom lives in the town where I grew up, and I always thought of it as a sort of a, unchanging kind of backwater small town. But now when I go there, suddenly there are, I can get, gourmet fresh pasta and ravioli, and there's an artisanal bakery, and there's, a fancy wine store, whatever it is. It's like whatever I thought of as like I had to go to Brooklyn to get that. It's now there in the suburbs. Now, I think the real interesting question is that the end of hipsterdom? If hipsterdom becomes universal, then what do the hipsters do? But I also feel like that is, it's a genuine economic problem for a lot of people, which is the cool places everybody wants to be are just out of reach, and so a lot of cool people in their 20s end up living back at home, and as a result they bring their culture to a place that they used to just go to the city. They were just rejecting the place they came from, but now they're back there and they are transforming it. So for somebody like me, it's actually like a total plus. There's like better food and cooler stuff to do in the suburbs.
Going further with that, and the relationships between, younger people moving back to the suburbs where like a lot of their family comes from, there's a lot in the book about the dynamic between like a mother and son, and even just like in the early chapters you get a lot of the way they're communicating through texting from both of their point of views. Is that something in your own relationships with your kids that you drew from and how they communicate, or is that something you kind of had to look into other sources to try to see how people communicate when they're maybe not as close, or when they're coming from different worlds, like the characters Eve and Brendan are?
Yeah, it was more like trying to imagine these two characters. Like basically my thought was like she would like to be one of those parents who's really involved with her kid's life, you know. And, you know, to some degree, you know, our daughter, when she went to college, she would call a lot. And so we knew what was going on. But our son, you know, he'll send an occasional text. So that, you know, and I'm sure you know, I mean, there's a whole spectrum of that,
Yeah,
you know.
absolutely.
But I just felt like it was important. You know, she's trying to get Brendan to do the bare minimum, and he can't do that. Like, that's really what's important there.
When you finish a book, is that the end of the characters for you, and relating kind of specifically to The Leftovers? Because I think the second and third season were more of a sequel-ish. They were an expansion of the story. And is that something you had thought about before it became a TV show, or was that something that as you were making it, you realized now we have to go somewhere new, and where do these characters go? And do you think about that with any of your other characters from other books?
Yeah, so, I mean, with The Leftovers, we kind of knew that we were going to get beyond the book at some point, if the show was successful and it went beyond 1 or 2 seasons. So I was prepared for the idea of that, but you know, to me, like, there's almost no, it's not like I imagine things outside of the process of writing. I might have some vague ideas, but it's the writing that makes it real. And so, you know, for instance, I have thought, like, a lot of people said, oh, I'd like to know what Tracy Flick is doing as an adult, say. And, like, I would too, but I would have to really want to know that enough to sit down and write it.
Explore
and I've never felt that urge. I mean, it's a hard thing to explain, because I think for readers, these characters live on. But for me as a writer, they live in the writing. You know,
especially people who discover them later on. You know, some people might read Little Children now, and you've already been through that, and they're now just experiencing it with these.
Yeah, no, and I imagine if we'd made a TV series of Little Children, and we got past the ending of the book, then we'd have to come up with a sequel to Little Children. You know, but it's not something that I think about outside of that context.
Okay, let's see, what else do I have? I've scratched and gone through and redrawn a few times. I guess I wanted to ask you about adaptations, because I know you helped write the screenplay for Little Children, and you were involved in writing The Leftovers. Is that something that you want to go back to, or did you, writing Mrs. Fletcher, rediscover, you know, I would much rather do narrative fiction writing, or are you interested to go back and explore either film script writing or working on another TV series?
Well, I'm going to try and adapt Mrs. Fletcher. So that's sort of the immediate thing that I'm thinking about. And that seems to be my pattern now, where I write a book and then I try to adapt it. And, you know, I think you could look at that and say, oh, that's sort of another bite of the apple, or that's like a little bit exploiting. But that only feels that way, I think, if you take like a very traditional hierarchical view, like there's the novel and the movie's a lesser thing. Like, I just don't feel that way. I feel like they can be, you know, equal works of art, and, you know, the differences really are exciting to me rather than scary.
So when you start to picture either, you know, like adapting Mrs. Fletcher specifically, are you in your head picturing actors, or are you just kind of, you have the characters of the characters, and then after you're done you start to think about who you would like to see in those roles, or is that something that comes earlier on, you have an idea of a person?
No, I think I might think of types, but I also want to keep an open mind, because just for instance, if you think about The Leftovers, neither Damon nor I had heard of Carrie Coon. You know, we saw an audition tape that this unknown actress sent, and we both had the same reaction of like, there's Nora, you know. And I think if you go into it, unless you really are writing something specifically for a particular performer, and there are some people who are great enough that I totally understand if somebody wanted to do that, I would rather keep an open mind. But I have some ideas in my own mind. Like, I feel like she shouldn't be so hot that, like, the minute she walked down the hall of her son's dorm, like, all the guys aren't going like, oh wow, you know what I mean? It's like, it's more like her sexuality is subtle, and she's not even aware of it, you know. So that, and obviously an actress can play that. It doesn't matter how sexy she is in real life, but I just, in my own mind, she's not like a drop dead, you know, movie star.
All right, well, thank you for sitting down with us. Really appreciate you coming down to Book Passage, and look forward to see what's coming next from you.
All right, my pleasure. Thanks for having me.